Hello everyone and welcome to topic 1 for ELS 134 or Instructional Materials Development and Evaluation. In this video, we are going to talk about terms and concepts in materials development. Let's dive right in. Before we start, however, I would first like to ask you to take out your module so you'd be guided throughout this discussion. Also, take out some paper and a pen so you'd be able to jot down notes about the things we'll be talking about in this lecture. So class, in this discussion, we are going to explore the definition of the following 5 terms and or concepts. So we have 5 here. That's materials, materials development, materials evaluation, language teaching, and language learning. We shall begin with the first term, which is materials. Materials here is defined as anything which is used by teachers or learners to facilitate the learning of a language. So I would assume that if I asked you guys to give me some examples of materials used by teachers in teaching English, you might probably say textbooks, grammar books, dictionaries, charts, audio tapes, and so on. All of these, by the way, are correct. These are indeed materials used by teachers when it comes to teaching the English language. That's correct. But class, materials here is again being defined as anything used by teachers to facilitate language learning. We are being instructed to take that literally. Therefore, literally anything that helps a person learn a language can be considered a material. So what are the more unconventional examples of materials that, although we don't commonly find inside the classroom, can still effectively teach a person about a language? So we have different tools. We can learn language from, let's say, YouTube videos. We can learn language from games or apps. We can learn language simply by listening to music, by using social media platforms, or by watching movies. We can even learn a few things about a language from the most random of things, like the wrappers on the products that we buy in the market. So again, my point here is anything that can be used by a teacher to help learners understand and use a language can be considered a material. So class, there are 4 types of materials: instructional, experiential, elicitative, and exploratory. The first one, instructional materials, are those materials that give us the basic information and characteristics of a language. Ito yung mga materials na nag-i-inform sa atin ng rules sa grammar, sa spelling, and etc. So therefore, we can consider dictionaries, grammar books, and textbooks under this category. The second one is experiential materials. Experiential materials are those that allow the students to observe how the language is being used in its natural setting. With this materials class, the students are essentially being asked to pay attention to how the language is being used by the native speakers. So materials na pwede natin maklasify under experiential ay perhaps songs and movies. I believe many of you would agree with me when I say na it's possible to learn how to use a language by listening to music or watching movies. So let me first share to you a story before we continue. So my father, he's always been a fan of watching foreign films. So pag nanonood siya ng TV, either Star Movies or HBO. And when I was still a young girl, I would always watch those movies alongside him. I didn't really understand what went on in the movies. I just liked to watch them. But unconsciously, just from simply watching those films, I started to learn even from a very young age how certain words are pronounced in English, what words belong together, what phrases are grammatically incorrect. So these things that I've learned about English are not yet necessarily the product of my schooling at that time, kasi again, I was really young, but rather the product of my exposure to these movies that help me understand how English is properly used. So the next one is elicitative materials. Elicitative materials class refers to those the teachers use to encourage learners to practice using the language. So personally, I would classify journals and even formal theme books, if you remember that, under this category. So I have another story for you. So when I was in college, I had a subject in Spanish. So my teacher at the time, my teacher was actually Ma'am Luna. She asked us to write every day in a diary about how our day went, what happened at school, etc., etc. But our entries in that diary had to be written in Spanish. Therefore, everything that I learned about Spanish at school during the daytime, I would be able to practice every time I went home and wrote in my diary. So again, elicitative materials essentially provide opportunities for students to practice the use of a language. And finally, class, we have exploratory materials. So these now refer to the materials or platforms that facilitates discoveries about language use by allowing the students to finally use the language in its natural setting. So perhaps we can consider the use of chat rooms or chat apps under this category if, for example, the student were to use that application to speak to a native speaker of the language that he or she is trying to learn. Therefore, providing an opportunity to practice kung ano yung mga natutunan niya about a language inside the classroom, and along the way, napapolish kung ano yung paggamit niya ng language in general. Now we'll be moving on to the second term, which is materials development. Since our next topic will be mainly focused on discussing ideas on how to develop materials, I'm not going to dwell too long in this term. Although I will mention that materials development refers to the actual process of making the instructional materials. A process guided, of course, by theories and principles tested out by numerous research to ensure effectiveness. The third term is materials evaluation, where material developers will now determine if the materials they created are successful in helping the students learn a language or not. Evaluation helps the developers understand if the material they created is easy to use or enjoyable for the student. So according kay Tomlinson, ang evaluation daw typically ginagawa before a material is released or is allowed to be used by teachers. However, it must be noted that he also mentioned na the effectiveness of a material can also be tested habang ginagamit siya at after niyang gamitin. Our fourth term is language teaching. Now, what is language teaching really? Well, language teaching is anything done by the teachers and the material developers to help students understand the language. So class, language teaching can take the form of direct language teaching. In this case, the teacher overtly transmits the information about the language to the students. But it can also be indirect, in which case, the teacher only facilitates the learning process while the students figure things out by themselves. I think it would be nice to share to you, class, that we are approaching the age of Education 4.0, where the teachers take on a new role inside the classroom. So in this new era of education, a teacher transforms from a sage on a stage to simply being a guide on the side, because we are now entering the era of independent learners. And finally, class, the last term is language learning. Learning about how to use a language can either be an explicit or implicit process. Kapag sinabi nating explicit, class, this is usually language learning that happens through formal education. So this happens inside the classroom with the help of teachers. With explicit learning, you're also made aware kung ano yung mga matututunan nyo, ano yung mga lessons sa pag-aaralan ninyo, at anong mga skills ang tinatarget nyong ma-develop. So, aware kayo dun. Usually, the teachers do this during the orientation sa pag-present nila ng course syllabus sa inyo. But the thing is, class, learning a language can also happen outside the classroom. So, learners may use tools and platforms na hindi prescribed ng kanilang mga guro to understand how to use a language. So, in this case, class, language learning happens subconsciously. Well, that is it, class. Those are all of the 5 terms that you will often encounter in the duration of this course. I hope you were able to understand all of them. And with this, we'll be moving directly to the next topic, which is going to be the framework of materials and methods. In that lesson, class, I will be explaining naman the entire process of how materials are developed and how teaching methods are selected. So, I'm going to explain the process from the very beginning up to the very end. So please do wait for announcements on the uploading of the materials regarding that upcoming lesson. So with that, thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you next time.